price elasticity of demand. So before we take an example, so let's try to understand what is meant by price elasticity of demand. But before then, what is elasticity? So assuming we have two variables, okay, let's be realistic. Let's say we have variable P and Q, that is the price and quantity demanded. So the theory of demand tells us that quantity demanded depends on price. So another way of saying this is that the quantity demanded is a function of price. In other words, quantity demanded responds to a change or changes in price. That is when the price of a commodity changes, say rice. When the price of rice changes, so the quantity demanded also changes. For example, the price of rices, we will expect the quantity demanded for rice to fall. All other things being equal. So from here we can understand that quantity demanded responds to the price. Okay, the law of demand states that, don't forget, that the higher the price of a commodity, the lower the quantity demanded, and the lower the price of the commodity, the higher the quantity demanded. So summarily, that tells you that the price of a commodity responds to changes in the price of that commodity. Okay, so from that idea, so we can compute price less of demand. Price elasticity of demand try to tell us that to what degree, that to what extent the quantity demand changes when the price of the commodity changes. So in other words, price elasticity of demand (PED) measures the degree of responsiveness, the degree of responsiveness, how responsive it is, responsiveness of quantity demanded. Am I right with it? Of a commodity to a change in the price of that commodity. So how do we measure um, this degree? So in other words, if you look at this, it says measure the degree of responsiveness or quantity demanded of a commodity to a change in the price of that commodity. Okay, so price of demand is defined as the ratio, the ratio, the ratio of the relative change in quantity demanded. So I'm shortening it to the relative change in price and the price of that commodity. In other words, so mathematically it can be expressed as the ratio of the relative change in quantity demanded. That is the Q2 minus Q1. So 1 by Q2, 1 by Q2. Q2 implies the new quantity demanded, while Q1 implies the old quantity demanded. So I can write it this way. I can write it this way. You can write this as change in Q, over Q1, okay, divided by change in P over P1, okay. where here we have what we call relative change in quantity demanded, and here we have relative change in price. So relative change in quantity demanded, then divided by relative change in price. That is why it's defined as the ratio of the relative change in quantity demanded to relative change in price. Okay, hope you are following. So we have, mind you, this Q1 here implies the initial quantity demanded, while this P1 here implies the initial price. Okay, so this can be rewritten as, we can rewrite this as Q2 minus Q1, then over Q1, okay, then divided by, or I can put the division sign here, divided by P2 minus P1 over P1. Okay, so in other words, I have relative change in quantity demanded, then divided by relative change in the price of the commodity, where Q2 implies the new quantity demanded, and Q1 implies the old quantity demanded. Likewise, P2 implies new price of the commodity, then P1 implies initial price of the commodity. Okay, so the same way we transform this to this place, I can also rewrite this same formula. I can write this same formula in this format. So let me clean this. Okay, let me clean here in order to have some space. So this can be written as change in Q over Q. Then we have divided by change in P over P1. So I can write this as change in Q over Q, then Q1 multiplied by P1 over change in P1 over change in P. Okay, so this is equivalent to this. Okay, so I can simplify further if I like to be this to be, I can swap the denominator. That is, I'm going to have change in Q over change in P, then I have multiplied by P1 over Q1. So this and this are equivalent. Okay, so you can see from this side I have change in Q over change in P. So which is equivalent to the Q, the P. Okay, if I'm given a function and I am asked to derive price of demand, so this formula will be useful. Okay, until we get there. So let's continue our discussion on this. Hope this is clear. Okay, so now we are coming from the angle that let's go back to this place. We are coming from the angle that the price of demand is calculated as the ratio of the relative change, the ratio of the relative change in quantity demanded to the relative change in price. Okay, so mind you, if I have just change in Q, this change in Q, this delta Q is reversed to as just change in Q. So, but once I divide this change in Q by the initial Q, that is Q1, it becomes relative change in Q. It becomes what? Relative change in Q. Likewise, if I have change in P, that is delta P. So this is just change in P. What if I divide by the initial P? So it becomes relative change in P. Okay, so another word, just change in Q here, we call it absolute change in Q. Absolute change in Q, also we call it absolute change in Q, or simply change in Q. Okay, So, but 1 is divided by Q1, initial can become relative change in Q. Ditto for change in P is also known as absolute change in P. 1 is divided by P1, by initial P becomes relative change in P. Hope you are following. Okay. Now look at this formula very well. We said it's the ratio of absolute change. Sorry, we said look at this formula very well. We said it's the ratio of the relative change in Q, that is the relative change in quantity demanded, to the ratio to the relative change in P. So this formula, I can manipulate this formula. I can convert this relative change to percentage change by simply multiplying it by 100. In other words, so relative change, you have a relative change multiplied by 100 becomes percentage change. It becomes a percentage change. Okay, it becomes a percentage. That in other words, if I multiply this by 100, it's going to give me percentage change in quantity demanded rather than just relative change in quantity demanded. Okay, so now let me convert that. In other words, if I multiply, that does not mean that I cannot use this formula. I can still use this formula, but I can still manipulate and convert it to percentage change. That is, once I multiply this by 100, okay, then I also multiply this by 100. You can see that this cancel out. It's just a matter of manipulation. So this what I have here becomes percentage. That is, then write the symbol percentage change in QD. Then what I have here becomes percentage change in P. Okay, that is why price of demand is also defined as percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change, let me write it in full, in price. Okay, so this is the angle from where they are coming. Okay, so you can see this is percentage change in quantity demanded and this is percentage change in price. So this, what we have as the numerator here, is equivalent to this, and this is what represents percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. This is what we have.